Hello, it's me. I don't know how to start these things. Okay, so we're reaching the end of the year, which, means a bunch of things. Days are getting darker, Christmas ornaments are going up, the dread is setting in. But for anyone in the music world, I think the end of the year always brings with it one question that we're all thinking about, talking about, and asking each other about. And that question is, what was your album of the year? Now, personally, I don't actually listen to a ton of new releases, but for me, there's no question as to my answer. My album of the year is this, Cindy Lee's Diamond Jubilee. It's this beautiful album, this sort of haunting, ethereal piece filled with warm, fuzzy guitar, and the whole thing feels like thumbing your way through a box of faded Polaroid photographs. It's got sound palettes that remind me of early Velvet Underground. It's got these beautiful pop melodies, and it's got just some of the sickest fuzz I've ever heard. It's a really transcendental album for me, and it's an album that just grows with each listen. So for me, barring any more surprise drops, Cindy Lee is undoubtedly my album of the year. Or at least it would be, but I've sort of got one issue with calling it my album of the year. And that issue is that this is not an album. This is a JPEG. Actually, it might be a PNG. We'll see. But the real reason why I don't think Diamond Jubilee can be my album of the year is that I don't think it's an album. Let's take a closer look. To understand the whole rant I'm going on today, we need to start with a brief history of the album as a medium. The word album has its roots in the Album Amicorum, a sort of autograph book that emerged in the 16th century. These books would contain little notes, poems, and drawings from friends to serve as reminders of those who were important to you or memorable events. When photographs came about in the 1800s, the concept of the album translated naturally to these collections of photographs. The phrase made its jump to the music world at the start of the 20th century with the birth of the recording industry. In those days, the recording medium of choice was the 10-inch 78 RPM record, which could hold around 3 minutes of music per side. As a quick aside, that 3-minute mark is why many pop songs to this day still hover around 3 minutes. For longer pieces, the 12-inch 78 RPM record allowed around 5 minutes per side, but that's still not much in the grand scheme of things. So when it came to packaging longer releases like ballets and symphonies, record companies had to get creative. In 1909, a company called Odeon released a recording of the London Palace Orchestra's Nutcracker Suite, one of the first true long-form releases in recording history. In order to record the full length of the suite, they had to release it across 7 record sides. They bound this release like a photo album with pages of records that you could flip through, and thus created the record album. Soon enough, these kinds of record albums became the norm for longer form pieces or for compilations of work. This carried on until the late 40s when a new kind of record was introduced, the long-playing vinyl record. These 12-inch 33 RPM discs could fit upwards of 20 minutes on a side, completely transforming the way that people listened to music. It took a few years for the LP to catch on, but by the end of the 50s, it was becoming standard. Early pioneers like Frank Sinatra saw the potential in using this new medium to release cohesive song cycles tied together by theme and emotion, and thus the modern album was born. By the mid-60s, acts like the Beatles and Bob Dylan were ushering in a new era of album-oriented rock, a movement that began to treat albums as their own art objects, tied together by singular aesthetic visions. The concept of the album became central to music discussions, and from there things exploded. LP sales soared through the 70s and 80s, and even as new forms of media were introduced, the conceptualization of the album as a unit of music and a distinct art object stuck. That conceptualization of the album has carried on into the modern age, and these days we sort of just use album as a shorthand for musical release. And in most cases, that's well and good, it makes sense. Frankly, the vast majority of things that are released in the modern world can be conceptualized as albums, so it's a useful term. But I also think that it is a term that has gained a certain level of cultural weight. When we discuss rating albums, when we discuss albums of the year, when we discuss greatest albums, all of these are tied around a conception of the album that is broadly still related to a physical medium, the vinyl record. To be clear, I'm an albums guy. I am canonically an albums guy. I love vinyl. I love the album as a conception. I frequently talk about how, in my mind, the best albums maintain that tether to the medium of the vinyl record. But even with that being said, I think there's something that's lost in the way that all of our conceptions around music are based around the album. I think for the most part, in the modern discourse, we sort of conceptualize music in two forms: the song and the album. And within this definition, the album is comprised of songs, but it's not just a collection of songs. It's a singular art object that we take as a representation of a certain moment in time, a certain aesthetic vision, or, a certain personal statement about the people who created it. But this conception of the album as an object didn't really come about until, the middle of the 20th century. Really, it was album-oriented rock that got people thinking like this. Before this, a lot of albums were just seen as collections of songs, and there's not really anything wrong with that, but when we're trying to evaluate an album as a singular, cohesive artistic statement, some old albums that are just kind of collections of songs don't hold up because they're not designed to be that way. The same goes for greatest hits albums. For a long time, I railed against greatest hits albums, and I still don't love them. I always say it's kind of like, taking the Mona Lisa smile and sticking it on the Vitruvian man's face and then putting him into The Last Supper or something and being like, here's Leonardo da Vinci. What you're getting is several pieces of different art objects jammed together into this sort of Frankenstein whole. But the thing is, the purpose that this serves is different than the purpose of an album, so it's not really fair to compare them. It's apples to oranges. And I think it stretches beyond that too. Musics that were made before the invention of recording technology, or even just before the invention of the long-playing record, don't tend to conform to our ideas of albums. And they don't have to, and they shouldn't, but in the modern framework for listening, it can cause problems. If you listen to classical music at all, you know that most streaming services really don't know what to do with it. And that's because these streaming services are sort of designed for this conception of music that we have: artist, album, song. But a lot of classical music works separate from that. You have composers, but you also have conductors. You have different orchestras playing the same symphonies. All of this stuff can make it really labyrinthine when you're trying to find a classical recording on most streaming services, to the point that Apple Music even has its own separate app for classical music. To conceptualize a ballet or a symphony as an album is to completely miss the point. Ironically enough, it's a lot of these symphonies that made up the earliest recorded albums, back when albums were a lot more like a photo album. And because this music doesn't fit into the conception of the album, it's often left out of modern music discussions. It would be odd to see Swan Lake next to Abbey Road on a list of greatest albums of all time, right? And by the same measure, when you're asking what's the best Billie Holiday album or what's the best Lead Belly album, the answer is not an album as we conceptualize it. These performers likely thought in terms of the song, so it can make this stuff inaccessible if you're someone who comes from our album world where, there's an idea that compilations are inherently lesser. Well, for a lot of these artists, they thought in terms of songs, so a compilation of their best songs is actually a great way to discover what they were about. A lot of early jazz recordings sort of operate in that framework. But it's not just old music. In its early days, hip-hop was not really a recorded music, at least not recorded professionally. It was something developed and distributed on a street level, and as a result of that, for a long time, the way that hip-hop artists got their start was with mixtapes. In the modern age, there's no clear definition of the term mixtape. Just as the conception of the album was based around the long-playing vinyl record, the conception of the mixtape is based around cassette tapes. Often these were homemade, handed out and distributed from the trunks of cars to friends throughout the neighborhood. And because of this sort of looser distribution, there's not as much weight put on mixtapes. They operate a bit more like show reels, demos of someone's talent, or sometimes just something that artists want to be taken a little less seriously than the album. Of course, as music has moved online, the medium of the mixtape has changed as well. It now lives in this sort of amorphous space where it's not quite an album, but sometimes things that are albums are called mixtapes, and sometimes things that are considered mixtapes are called albums. There's not really a clear line here, and it causes some confusion. But broadly, I like the idea of the mixtape. I like the idea of having a medium that artists can use that doesn't imply the same kind of level of scrutiny and cohesive vision that album has come to imply. But the mixtape doesn't really exist outside of hip-hop. I guess the closest you could come to is EPs, but there's not the same cultural weight and history with the EP as there is with the mixtape. I think the modern version of the mixtape as a medium is the playlist, right? They're both born from the same DIY communitarian impulse. And, I actually really liked it when Drake released More Life, not as an album, but as a playlist. I didn't think it was a very good playlist, but I thought that the conception of online music as a playlist was novel and exciting, and I kind of wished more artists did it. Calling a release a playlist rather than an album is a signal to the listener as to how the artist wants you to engage with it. They don't necessarily want you to be thinking of it in the same terms as you categorize your albums. And I think that's really cool. The digital world has allowed for a sort of flexibility of media that we historically never had, and I wish that more artists would take advantage of that. And I also wish that we as music creators and music fans would stretch our conceptualizations of what music could be in this kind of way. Another form that has become more and more prevalent, especially among younger generations in recent years, is the soundtrack. The experience of evaluating and listening to a soundtrack is different than listening to an album because it's sort of not its own thing. It's inherently tied to this other piece of media. Over the last 20 years, as video games have exploded, the popularity of listening to soundtracks has only gone up. For a lot of people, most of the music that they listen to is video game music. And that is by no means a bad thing. There's just as much artistic merit to a soundtrack as there is to an album. It's just that the experience of listening to it changes. If you're listening to the soundtrack of a game you love or a movie you love, your emotional experience is inherently tied to another piece of media. There's an inherent hybridity to the soundtrack. Except when there isn't. Carpenter Brute's 2018 album Leatherteeth presents itself as the soundtrack to an imagined film. That film is a schlocky send-up of 80s horror, inspired by power metal, VHS aesthetics, and just general 80s nostalgia. By framing what otherwise might be called an album within this context, Carpenter Brute is inviting you to create your own imagined intertextuality. When you hear this music, you get to have your own private movie, playing your own visions of this concept out in your head as you listen to the music. Of course, you could envision Leatherteeth as an album in the tradition of the great concept albums of years past, and those were influences, but I think if we open ourselves up to Carpenter Brute's packaging of the idea and engage with this not as an album, but as a soundtrack, we'll have a richer experience. All this discussion of packaging and release brings us back to the album that set us off on this whole rant in the first place, Diamond Jubilee. Diamond Jubilee wasn't released on any streaming platform. Instead, it was released on its own GeoCities page, as well as in an extended YouTube video. Now, that GeoCities page does describe it as a triple album, and it also has an LP release on Bandcamp, but I still think that this release, especially the GeoCities page, invites you to engage with it in a different way. For me, this kind of release brought forth a nostalgia for the old internet, where I spent my teens crawling through strange websites looking for any kind of music that was new and different. And that seems deliberate because the album itself is such a study in nostalgic sound palettes, blending together all of these sounds from these different underground cult classic acts. This kind of release, along with the album's extended structure, changes the way that I listen to it. I have actually seldom listened to it front to back in one sitting. Far more often, I'll go to turn it on and just let it play from wherever it was when I last listened. That's not how albums are meant to be listened to, but for me it provides a richer experience, and it works well with the sort of ambient tones of the album. The entire vision of ambient music put forth by its pioneers like Brian Eno was the idea of music you could listen to forever. Albums inherently have a start and an end. There's a sort of conclusive narrative there. Ambient music challenges this. And I think a lot of ambient releases also challenge the medium of the album. There is a lot that's lost in the detachment from physical media, but there's also so much that's gained. The potentiality of music is unlike it ever has been before. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved poking around YouTube and finding sort of strange musical projects that defy my conception of what music can do. And often these defy our conception of the album as well. One of the greatest examples of this is Everywhere at the End of Time. I didn't come to Everywhere at the End of Time from any albums list or anything like that. I was just sort of browsing YouTube one time and the image came up and it was interesting. So I clicked it and listened to it and was treated to just this surreal, strange, and horrifying world. Everywhere at the End of Time is a project meant to evoke dementia by using old music hall records that degrade over time, becoming fuzzier, stranger, and more distant, until at the end, it's just this. I don't think this is a project that's made to be listened to front to back in one sitting. It's a little too daunting for that. I mean, people do it, and I'm sure it's a pretty profound experience doing it, but also I think it sort of exists to be clicked around, jumped around in, and engaged with more actively, something that's become a lot easier on digital platforms. And more than just speaking about dementia, nostalgia, and all of these things, I think the piece itself is a very profound statement on the nature of media. It's a piece that stretches longer than is practical for any kind of physical media, and it's all built around the aesthetics of the destruction of physical media. You know, it's something that, in my mind, is very much tied to the online world, and something that becomes really diminished when you conceptualize it as just an album. There's a lot of long-form pieces in ambient music and noise music that are like this. A lot of these thoughts have actually been gesticulating for me because of a recent episode of Ghost Notes we did on noise music. If you want to check that out, I think it's out on Nebula. If it's not out on Nebula, it'll be coming out soon. I don't know the release of my own podcast, but it's gonna be out soon. It's a good listen. I think what I'm trying to get at here is that there is a gap in our musical language. We conceptualize so much in terms of the album, and we attach so much cultural baggage to every release, trying to frame things as albums, where really the language of that album is one kind of specific musical tradition. You know, it's a rich tradition, but it's not all encapsulating. There's a lot more out there, and in the digital world, we have more potential than ever to do experimental sound art pieces, to do extended ambient dreamscapes, to do these things that defy what the album is. I think there's a temptation to come up with a word to define non-album things, but again, I don't know. Is that just defeating the purpose? Maybe the purpose is just in breaking down the barriers created by language and challenging the baggage that we bring to music with our own conceptualization of media. That's it, I guess. I don't know. I'm sure you guys can think of some suggestions of non-album albums. I would love to hear your suggestions on this because, you know, I'm interested in this stuff. I like anything that pushes these kinds of bounds. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed these ramblings. I don't really think there's that much to come of this, but if nothing else, it's good to think about music in this way. It enriches your experience of music, and it creates a better world for us all. You're a hero for doing this, is what I'm saying. For watching this video, you're a hero, and you're even more of a hero if you like and subscribe. Throughout this video, much of my discussion of the album is sort of focused on the Western world and how we operate with music. But really, peoples from around the world have all kinds of different traditions and conceptions of what music can be and how music can operate. And the absolute best way to discover that is when you're traveling yourself. But if you set out on an international music quest, you're probably going to need some data sometimes. And this week's sponsor, Saily, can help you with that. Saily is a new eSIM app with access to affordable plans in more than 160 countries. With one download of Saily, you'll be able to access plans for nearly anywhere you want to travel. You'll be able to save time in transit without having to wait to get local SIMs in airports. You won't need to be wandering around looking for public Wi-Fi spots. You'll just be able to have data everywhere, which honestly, as someone who has recently done a lot of traveling, it's a life changer. Like it really does make things a lot better. And Saley is super easy to use. All you got to do is download the app, find a plan you like, and then punch in my coupon code, and you'll get 15% off of your eSIM plan. So if you've got any international travel coming up, you should check it out. Once again, all you got to do is download the app, choose your plan, and then punch in my coupon code on checkout. So why not give it a shot? And hey, if you are going on a spiritual international music finding quest, happy travels. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.